Thank you for joining me in this next of our studies in the book of the Bible called the Gospel of Mark. Today we're looking at the first section of chapter 2, verses 1 to 12. And here is what Mark tells us. A few days later, when Jesus entered Capernaum, the people heard that he'd come home. They gathered in such numbers that there was no room left, not even outside the door, and he preached the word to them. Some men came bringing to him a paralyzed man, carried by 4 of them. Since they could not get him to Jesus because of the crowd, they made an opening in the roof above Jesus by digging through it and then lowered the mat the man was lying on. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralyzed man, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Now some teachers of the law were sitting there thinking to themselves, "Why does this fellow talk like that? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone?" Immediately, Jesus knew in his spirit that this was what they were thinking in their hearts, and he said to them, "Why are you thinking these things? Which is easier, to say to this paralyzed man, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or to say, 'Get up, take your mat and walk'? But I want you to know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins." So he said to the man, "I tell you, get up, take your mat, and go home." He got up, took his mat, and walked out in full view of them all. This amazed everyone, and they praised God, saying, "We've never seen anything like this." By now, if you've been following this series of talks, you will know that Mark, the author of this book, was himself a friend of one of Jesus' best friends, Simon, or Peter as he's better known. And he was a colleague too of the first great Christian ministry, Paul of Tarsus. Mark has already told us that he is writing because he believes the story he's recording is good news from God. And just in case we missed it the first time, we find the words "good news" are repeated several times in the first chapter by Mark himself, John the Baptist, and then Jesus, who is, as we have seen, the subject of Mark's book. But what is the good news? As the first chapter unfolded, Mark indicated that Jesus is the good news, for he had been promised for centuries as the one whom God would send to sort out the mess into which human beings had fallen. Indeed, and Mark knows it's an extraordinary claim, he says that Jesus is that deliverer and is God in a human body, or, as it's sometimes said, God incarnate. In the stories he's already told, Mark places before us some of the evidence he saw and heard himself, or had gathered from other first-hand witnesses. This evidence that had convinced him that his unbelievable claims were actually true is such that he wants to persuade and assure us that he and his friends were and are right in their claims. In the last study we studied together, Jesus healed a man who was a leper, and as we saw there, claimed to meet the man's inner needs by cleansing as well as healing him from his appalling disease. We also noted that Jesus, though he'd only just started his work, anticipated that he would face opposition. Mark appears to include the story we've just read together to give further evidence for his and Jesus' claims. So a few days after the healing of the leper, Jesus is back in Capernaum, his hometown at the time, and crowds come to the door. This is not surprising. Mark has already told us that Jesus had taught, healed, and exorcised those who suffered from demon possession, and that this had prompted the local community to gather to Jesus' lodgings in Simon Peter's house. Now Jesus is back home. They are there again in such numbers that the house is full, and many are clamouring to see Jesus from the street outside. The detailed way in which Mark records all this suggests once again that he's drawing upon witnesses who were there. Perhaps that included himself. But the details also tell us that Jesus was immensely popular. While the crowd may not have fully understood what he was saying, there was something about what he said and the way that he backed it up with what he did that attracted ordinary people to him. They looked forward to hearing his words. And this seems to be part of Mark's point. Those without their own personal agendas were only too willing to come to welcome Jesus. And Mark's point is surely that he expects this still to be the case. Open minds, open and inquiring minds, and open hearts still, he believes, welcome Jesus. However, Mark's first big aim in telling this story is to emphasize once again, and not for the last time, that Jesus is good news from God. Notice then how he demonstrates this in the first section of our passage. Now, the Bible's silences are sometimes illuminating. We do not know if this man's experience of suffering had brought an awareness of his unpreparedness to meet God, as the leper's condition had. Perhaps this paralyzed man had no real sense of need beyond the desire to be able to move, sit up and walk and run again. Whichever was true, and could Scripture's silence here be deliberate, Jesus went to the heart of the matter. Very simply, he said to this man, identifying his deepest need and dealing with it, "Dear child of mine, your sins are forgiven." It is, of course, true that paralysis is a serious illness, and it's probably recorded by Mark precisely because it was and is little short of a living death. However, the story is intended to indicate the problem of our living unforgiven by God is even more serious. And the very seriousness of this man's condition makes this point very starkly. It's very interesting to notice that the physical healing is not recorded until the end of the passage. After all, by now, we expect Jesus to heal this man effortlessly, however serious his condition. What is far more important to Mark at this point is the conversation that followed, Jesus' words. Let me read them again to you, because they're absolutely vital to what has recorded for us here. So he says, "Now, some teachers of the law were sitting there, thinking to themselves, 'Why does this fellow talk like that? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone?'" We will return to these leaders again in a few minutes, but they had got one thing absolutely right. Only God can forgive sins committed against God. In fact, it's obvious if we think about it. None of us can really forgive on behalf of others. We can only forgive on behalf of those who've offended us. But words can be cheap. So if Jesus is God in a human body and can therefore deal with our deepest needs of God's forgiveness, he needs and needed to prove it. And Jesus knew this. And so he performed the miracle that this man and his friends had sought for. As far as we are concerned, a miraculous healing, such as is described in this passage, is far more convincing than mere words, isn't it? Mark will, of course, continue to record that Jesus performed miracles of such magnitude and number as the world has never seen before or since. So, he implies, we should listen intently to Jesus' words. So Mark argues in this incident that Jesus reveals himself as one fully able to meet with the problem of our alienation from God. He is indeed incarnate God, able and willing to forgive and to bring an end to our shame and guilt, and wonder of all wonders, to make us once again members of God's family, and to do this now. Notice then how Jesus describes this man as a son and offers him forgiveness here on earth. Here then is certainly good news, since the same can surely be true for us now. This is demonstrated by two incidents in the story. Notice how simple and humble trust is emphasized. No words were uttered, and the paralyzed man could do no more than willingly accede to the actions of his friends, but that was sufficient for him to receive forgiveness and adoption into God's family, and in his case, miraculous healing. But the need for single-minded seeking of Jesus is emphasized by the way in which the friends went to great lengths to ensure that their friend was brought before Jesus. And Mark's point is that those who single-mindedly and humbly bring their needs to Jesus will find his answer no different today. My child, says Jesus, even today, your sins are forgiven. However, we cannot miss the fact that not all reacted in the same way to Jesus. So Mark teaches us that too often our closed minds and hearts prevent us from receiving Jesus. The religious and intellectual authorities were faced with a theological and logical question, to which they offered a correct answer. Either Jesus is God, or he blasphemes. Indeed, they were also correct in their implied assertion that actions speak louder than words. Jesus' response might not have offered absolute proof, but it was at least a provisional answer to their question. He healed the man. It should surely have given them a reason to reflect upon what they had seen and heard. In fact, Mark believes that accompanied by the other things that Jesus had said and done, they should have really had no doubts. Right at the end of the passage we are studying, Mark tells us, this amazed everyone, and they praised God, saying, "We've never seen anything like this." Now, in a similar situation in Matthew's Gospel, Matthew tells us that the crowds reacted in the same way as here, by saying nothing like this has ever been seen in Israel. And this is surely the point. These people lived in a community which over many centuries had uniquely experienced the awesome and miraculous activity of God. But now something unprecedented, even where they lived, was taking place. We learn then that sometimes it's not the lack of evidence that's the problem. The world does change rapidly, but people don't change that much. The causes and the foolishness of unbelief are frequently the same today. Faced with such awesome events as has been described so far in Mark's Gospel, how then do we respond? But one final point before we leave this wonderful story. I want us to be amazed together as we reflect upon the Jesus who's described here. He's someone who we surely recognize as beautiful and supremely attractive. He's kind and gracious, as seen in the tender way in which he dealt with the paralyzed man. The man and his friends sought Jesus for healing, but Jesus immediately recognized this man's deepest needs of forgiveness by God, offered him assurance that his need was met, and encouraged him with speaking to him with the tenderness of a father to a son. Mark, of course, is sure that this is true of all those who seek Jesus. Yet Jesus' grace is also seen in his willingness to meet his opponents at the point of their foolishness and seek to awaken their faith in him. Sometimes we can make decisions about things without enough thought. Jesus is here ready to give people time. And we know some of these leaders did eventually recognize who he was and followed him. So it is possible to read the response of the leaders as illustrating vividly the foolishness of our turning our backs on such a lovely Saviour, but the story also encourages us to recognize that facing up to the claims of Jesus can be challenging, deeply challenging, and time might be needed to process our encounters with him.